Hi, today what we're going to do following our recap is get into classical theory. So here's where we really begin to see sociological theory, as a formal discipline. So we'll get into that today, and then we'll begin our first classical theorist as well, looking at Marx and his co-author, Engels. So just to remind ourselves of what we did last class, we did our first theory reading, and in doing so, we went over Machiavelli's The Prince. And so The Prince was a theory of social control, and Machiavelli wrote this theory of social control to, help his countrymen, to help the kind of the powers that be maintain their control during a lot of major social changes. So that's why the context is important to understand kind of why he was motivated to write it. He wanted to make sure that all these major transitions going on during the Italian Renaissance, that they would be still in their positions of power when the dust settles, as they say. So, as a theory of social control, specifically, we can say that he was trying to explain effective rule, basically how to rule over people effectively. And then how we unpack it in terms of the how, he talks about being feared rather than being loved. He talks about you have to avoid being hated by people, and because if they begin to hate you, then they'll turn on you. And then also he talks about being very good with your words, honoring your word, but do it lightly, and always having kind of a greater good, a greater cause in terms of why you're kind of doing what you're doing. And then also we talked about those symbols of the fox and the lion. You need to have the mental strength, the street smarts, but also you need to have that physical strength as well when push comes to shove. Again, not necessarily the person, the individual having the strength, but having a collective strength behind you, such as an army, such as a police force. So we said, although this was written back in the early 1500s, we can still apply to our lives today. And, as a lens, we can see, why people rule in the ways they do a little bit differently when we see it through Machiavelli's interpretation. And then kind of as a tool, the theory provides us a way of kind of understanding things a little bit more. We understand why, the authority figure is ruling in one way or ruling in another way when we use Machiavelli's theory to understand it a little bit differently. And then using his why, according to Machiavelli, different people may not agree with this, but according to Machiavelli, he says people can't be trusted. They're fickle. They'll turn on you if they get a chance to. And so that's why Machiavelli says, this is how you rule. You have to rule in this way because you can't trust people. If you could trust people, maybe you could rule differently, but you can't. So this is why you have to do it, A, B, and C. And so we talked about the relevance of this, again, written in the early 1500s. We can still see it today. We can apply to how a parent parents, how a coach coaches, how a teacher teaches. Anybody in a position of authority, we can apply this theory to kind of understand perhaps what they're doing and why they're doing it. And you could use it for a study. You could study social control. A coach kind of coaches in A, kind of how Machiavelli theorized, and a coach coaches in way B, a different way. More of a friendly approach to coaching. Really wants the players to love him or her, and then you could look at the two different styles of coaching and study who gets more control, who gets more obedience. Coach A, the Machiavelli style, or Coach B, a different style of rule, a different style of control, and then kind of do your study like that and see the results. So, we'll leave that there and move forward to our focus on classical theory today. And classical theory, we're jumping up to the 19th century. So more or less, we're looking at the 1850s, mid 1800s, when looking at a classical theory. And just like Machiavelli, when a lot of major social changes are going on, that's what we see here during this time period. We see what we call the Industrial Revolution. and everything that's entailed in that. And so, one major thing that will come up a lot is the emergence of capitalism. So, for a lot of us, it's hard to imagine, any other way of organizing society, but capitalism only came onto the scene for the first time during this time period. And so a lot of people were interested in, how this new kind of mode of production changes life as a whole. Another thing that was new at the time was globalization here with a more uppercase G, where the world was becoming more interconnected in terms of people visiting places, people trading, goods with one another, people traveling simply to migrate and move somewhere. And also, we can recognize those modern nation states that we talked about, starting with Machiavelli in that time period. Now we see those modern nation states coming together. And so the map that we know today looks very similar to kind of how the map is now in terms of the different countries and nation states. Industrialization and technological advances kind of come together, with capitalism. A lot of these things all are interrelated in terms of the social changes going on. You have industrialization capturing a lot of movement from labor on the land, farming type labor, to now labor within a factory. And that labor in a factory is only possible with the new types of machinery and new types of technology. And then finally, we can talk about urbanization. So, when people are moving off the land into the factories, a consequence of that, people are moving away from rural areas to more urban areas. And so, for the first time, we see what we call urbanization, these kind of urban spaces developing with a lot of people densely packed in together in one social space. So, here, as a whole, during this time period, we say this is the emergence of modern society. And this is the start of what we call modernity. And we're looking at in these theories how modernity kind of creates a different life for people, how these social changes that promote this new historical period of modern society, how do they reorganize our life? And so these are the key questions. How does capitalism, how does urbanization, how does this new technology kind of reshape the way we live our lives? And so this semester, we'll be looking at the big three of classical theory. Some semesters we look at 4 classical theorists, but this semester what we're going to be doing is concentrating on the big three. And those big three are Marx and Engels, Durkheim in the middle, and then to the right of the screen, you have Max Weber. And so when we talk about Marx and Engels, I collapse them into kind of one. Marx and Engels we'll talk about more later, but they wrote together, and sometimes Marx wrote individually, but sometimes when we talk about both of them, we just say Marx. And so when I do that throughout our lectures, and I just say Marx, I'm not intentionally leaving out Engels, but I'm just trying to save a little bit of breath, a little bit of time, and saying Marx rather than Marx and Engels over and over again. And similarities among the 3 classical theorists, we can say that they're all interested in this new modern society emerging. They're all interested in these social changes going on, whether it be the economy. Marx is really interested in the new capitalist economy, and so was Weber. Durkheim's really interested in kind of social order, kind of these new ways of living. Weber, in addition to the economy, is interested in urbanization. So, they're looking at the emergence of modernity, but they look at it a little bit differently, so they kind of touch on different aspects of it. And I believe, Gardner in her book talks about how they're all kind of looking at the same elephant, but they're looking at different parts of the elephant in terms of what they theorize. So each also has a theoretical spin. And so we look at 2 different theories at the beginning of the semester of social change. We'll look at a social change theory in the Communist Manifesto with Marx and Engels, and we'll look at a social change theory in Durkheim in the Normality of Crime. So they're both trying to explain, how society evolves, how society moves forward. but they put a different spin on it. And the Marxist spin, we're going to learn, it's always that economy. It's always in modernity. It's always that capitalist system that's kind of promoting whatever they're looking at in the theory. And for Durkheim, the spin is culture. It's always kind of cultural ways, cultural forces that's driving society, that's creating kind of the action, whatever the action he's looking at in his theory. So we'll learn those spins, as we go forward through the semester. And so a little bit of background into Marx and Engels. As I mentioned before, always read Gardner's kind of context into the authors, into the theorists, because she does an excellent job talking about kind of who they are, again, the time in which they're living, and how those things come together to influence, what they actually write. And so Marx and Engels, in comparison to the, other two classical theorists, they're more well known. They have what I say, kind of a wide cultural reach. So even if you've never read Marx and Engels, you've probably heard of Karl Marx before, compared to if you don't take, sociology classes, if you don't take criminology classes, you may never heard of Emil Durkheim, or you may never heard of Max Weber. So in addition to kind of having that wide cultural reach, one thing people don't recognize often is that they're misinterpreted in terms of when you say Marx. A lot of people say, oh, it's this anti-capitalism and blah, blah, blah. And that's not necessarily true, because they believe that capitalism was a step forward for society. They believed, compared to other ways of organizing society, other modes of production, as we call them, such as slavery, such as feudalism. They said capitalism is a step forward, and we'll get into that more. But capitalism provides people more equality compared to the earlier ways, feudalism and slavery, and it provides people more autonomy, more freedom compared to the earlier ways of organizing society. Now, their critique of capitalism is simply about we can do even better. So yes, capitalism improves equality, improves freedom, but we can move even forward again. And just like we advanced from slavery to feudalism to capitalism, we can continue to advance. And with those advancements, we can continue to get more freedom and more equality. So just quickly, some bios. Again, make sure you're reading the book, because Gardner does a good job here. But we can say that Marx was a kind of a working class radical, and he often struggled with money because he was getting chased away from kind of one country to another by kind of the regimes in control. They didn't like Marx that much. They thought he was a troublemaker, so they're kind of chasing him around. And when you're getting chased by the authority figures, it's tough to stay put and work a steady job. So often he couldn't have a steady job, and Engels, his friend and writing partner, would help him out in terms of money. And Engels had that money because he kind of inherited a lot of wealth from his family. So that's why I say Engels was a radical in the sense that they wanted to promote change, but he was more of a wealthy upper class radical, and he would use his money to kind of help finance Marx and everything they did together. And they both shared interest in inequality, interest in power, and they're close friends as well as kind of writing partners. Gardner tells one of the stories that I think captures that closeness of friendship when she talks about Marx got his maid pregnant, and then Marx was married at the time, so he didn't want the cat to come out of the bag and his wife to find out. So Engels actually stepped up and said the kid was his. So again, I think I have a lot of good friends, but if I ever did that, I don't think my friends would step up and claim the kid for their own. So I just think that kind of captures that closeness of the relationship between Marx and Engels. So here we're going to spend a little bit of time to conclude our class today, breaking down Marx's dialectical method, because this is key to understand the theories as a whole we'll be looking at in our next couple class periods. But also it's key to really recognizing the first reaction paper that you're going to be doing, the paper on the Communist Manifesto. So basically, this kind of dialectical method is about explaining social movement, how society moves forward, how society experiences progress. And so Hegel, at the time, George Hegel kind of put together his dialectical method to explain how society moves forward. And Hegel believed that ideas of a certain time period, ideas that kind of people have, collectively speaking, ultimately move society forward. And so, kind of these ideas that are created in the past ultimately influence what's going on and promote a new future. So, here for the first time, somebody is theorizing that the past creates the future. And for us, that may not seem like any kind of paradigm shift in thinking. It just makes sense to us. But at this time, a lot of people explaining, society moving forward, again, kind of turn to religious forces. Basically, society moves in one direction or another because of the God or gods above, kind of promoting that change. Here, what Hegel does is kind of take that away from the gods and why we go in one direction or another, socially speaking, is about how we think in one time period, and those thoughts ultimately promote a different path that we take later on. So, Marx was a big fan of Hegel. During this time period, intellectuals were celebrities, and Hegel is probably the biggest intellectual celebrity of this time period. And Marx was one of his biggest fans. And so it was kind of interesting that Marx later basically trashes Hegel and says, your dialectical method is wrong, and it's wrong because, ideas don't move society forward. Instead, material forces such as, new technologies that emerged in society, those are responsible for kind of moving society in one direction or another. So Marx basically keeps the idea that kind of the past influences the present and the future, but rather than ideas, he says it's material forces in a time period, those different technologies that we use to create what we need for human existence. Those material forces ultimately shape kind of where we go and why we go in that direction. So what I'm going to do to kind of look at these two dialectical methods together is explain, the movement from the different ways of organizing society, how we move from slavery slash serfdom, feudalism to capitalism, whether it be kind of looking at the United States, how we kind of got rid of slavery and just kind of embraced capitalism, or looking at, different regions around the world when they kind of had that middle step of feudalism. So we'll kind of explain it through Hegel, and then we'll explain it through Marx's dialectical method. So according to Hegel, how he would explain, why we move from slavery slash serfdom to capitalism, he says basically, people during a certain time period, during slavery, during a serfdom, people were thinking about different ways we can organize society. And so, slaveholders, the free people would say that, perhaps there's a better way to do things. Perhaps, we can still get what we need for human existence, but we can organize society differently to achieve those needs, the clothing, the food, the shelter, the protection. So rather than slavery, let's try to think of a new way of doing things. And ultimately, feudalism, serfdom emerges. Serfdom, you still have serfs who are slave-like, but serfs have more freedom, more opportunities, more equality compared to slaves. So ultimately, the new way of organizing society, serfdom, is progress, is moving forward, because you do have more freedom, more opportunities as a serf compared to if you were a slave. And then again, over time, the lords, the non-serfs, were thinking about perhaps new ways of organizing society, where the serf becomes more or less a free person and more equality within this new system, and that's when capitalism emerges. So according to Hegel, people are benevolent. People are nice. So this would contradict like Machiavelli's position on people. Machiavelli says you can't trust people. Hegel believed that we're kind of, good by nature. We want to do good for people, and that's why we advance in society. And these advancements from slavery to serfdom to capitalism, with each advancement, we have more freedom, more equality. So, Marx will look at that same pattern of moving from one direction to another. But again, rather than people thinking in different ways, he concentrates on the creation of new material forces, specifically new technologies, we can say, that promote the change. So, according to Marx, we can say that, why people would move from feudalism to capitalism, it just makes more sense to do that for them. So the powers that be, the lords, uh, they, so let's concentrate on feudalism. So, the lords to kind of do what they had to do to create, what they needed, the food, the shelter, the clothing. They had to basically, look over, these serfs. So let's say that, a lord is looking over, 200 serfs. And that's a job that you have to do, 365 days a year. And you have to feed them, you have to clothe them, you have to protect them, all to a certain degree where they're healthy enough to do the work that you make them do. And then what we start to see kind of during the kind of middle part and late part of feudalism is new technologies, new material forces start to emerge. So material forces such as, let's say the cotton gin or iron plows, where you can, do different types of farming. And so when you have these plows for the first time, when you have a cotton gin, you don't rely on all these serfs to, do the picking, to do the planting and the harvesting. You can rely on the technology to do the work of 10 or 20 serfs. So it just makes more sense that rather than looking after these people, 365 days a year, 24/7, when in actuality, they're only kind of working, a large part of the serfs only worked on the land, and that was seasonal work. So, a lot of the time, if it was bad weather outside, or if the harvest is already done, they're not doing anything for you, but you still have to look after them. In a capitalist system, instead of looking over these serfs, 365, 24/7, basically what you do, you hire wage workers and you only look over them, when they're on the job, and you give them their wage for the work, which you set yourself. So you can set those wages to be low, and you still kind of get the majority of the benefits of their work being done. And you no longer have to worry about taking care of, all these serfs, when they punch out, when they clock out, and, they're on their own time. So yes, that comes with more freedom. The worker has more freedom, more equality compared to the serf. But it wasn't people being nice, according to Marx. It just made more sense that you didn't have to look over all these slaves. You didn't have to look over all these serfs. And when you had the technology that allowed you to do the work for them, and also when you start to have this capitalist system that you just pay them a wage, you don't have to worry about them anymore. So that's what you start to see in Marx, and you'll start to see that kind of focus on how a mode of production of society, how you organize society, kind of ultimately starts to move society forward. In your first reading, you're going to have the Communist Manifesto. So in the Communist Manifesto, you're going to see a theory of social change. So that's the theme you'll be looking at. And basically, you're going to look at how society is moving forward. And with this becomes first opportunity for the reaction paper. And that reaction paper 1 is due September 7th. And you'll find the guidelines for reaction paper 1 in our D2L content section. So I'll leave that there for today. Always get in touch with me if you have any questions. Otherwise, I'll be in touch with you.